The northern waters stretched endless and gray beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds. Captain Victor Harmon stood at the helm of the fishing vessel named Iron Wake, his weathered hands gripping the wheel as the boat cut through waves that grew angrier by the minute. Behind him, his crew of 12 worked the deck, hauling nets filled with the silver flash of Arctic cod. They had been at sea for 3 weeks, and their hold was nearly full. One more day, Victor thought. One more day, and they would return home to their families with enough money to survive the coming winter. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. Frost gathered on the metal railings, and the men's breath came out in thick white clouds. First Mate Elena Kozlov moved among the crew, checking their safety lines and shouting orders over the howling wind. She was the toughest sailor Victor had ever known. A woman who had grown up on fishing boats and knew the sea better than she knew dry land. Something changed in the water. The waves that had been pushing against the hull suddenly went still. An unnatural calm spread across the surface of the ocean, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. Victor felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In 40 years of sailing these waters, he had never seen anything like this. Marcus Chen, the youngest member of the crew at just 19 years old, was the first to see it. He was coiling rope near the starboard side when a shadow passed beneath the boat. The shadow was longer than the Iron Wake itself, which measured over 60 meters from bow to stern. Marcus opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the words died in his throat as the creature rose from the depths. The sea serpent's head broke the surface 20 meters from the ship. Water cascaded from scales that gleamed like polished obsidian, each one the size of a dinner plate. The creature's neck was thick with muscle, cords of power rippling beneath its armored skin as it lifted higher and higher into the air. Its eyes were golden and ancient, filled with an intelligence that seemed impossible for any animal. When it opened its mouth, rows of teeth like curved daggers caught the gray light of the dying day. Victor had heard stories of sea serpents from old sailors in port taverns. He had always dismissed them as fairy tales, the kind of nonsense that drunk men told to impress younger crew members. Now, staring at a creature from myth made terrifyingly real, he understood that those old sailors had not been lying. They had simply been unlucky enough to survive encounters like this one. The serpent struck without warning. Its massive head slammed into the port side of the Iron Wake with the force of a battering ram. The entire ship lurched sideways, throwing men from their feet and sending equipment sliding across the deck. The hull groaned in protest, metal bending under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Elena was shouting commands before Victor could react. She had already grabbed a flare gun and was firing into the air, the red light streaking upward in a desperate call for help that no one within 100 kilometers would see. The Serpent circled the boat, its enormous body creating a whirlpool that pulled at the vessel, dragging it in slow circles. Victor grabbed the radio and called for help on every channel. Static answered him. The creature's body was creating some kind of electromagnetic interference, or perhaps the storm above was blocking their signal. Either way, they were alone. 12 humans against a monster from the deep, with nothing but the tools on their boat and their own stubborn will to survive. The Serpent struck again. This time, its jaws clamped down on the crane that they used to lift heavy nets. Metal screamed as the creature tore the entire structure from the deck and tossed it into the sea like a child discarding a broken toy. The attack left a gaping hole in the deck, and freezing seawater began pouring into the lower compartments. Boris Volkov, the ship's engineer, disappeared below deck to assess the damage. He emerged moments later, his face pale beneath his thick beard. The flooding was severe. They had maybe 30 minutes before the Iron Wake went down. The lifeboats were their only chance, but the Serpent was circling the ship like a shark around wounded prey. Anyone who entered the water would be killed instantly. It was young Marcus who came up with the plan. He had been watching the Serpent's movements, noting how its golden eyes tracked any motion on the deck. The creature was hunting them, waiting for someone to make a mistake. But it was not striking randomly. It was intelligent. It was patient. And that meant it could be fooled. Marcus explained his idea quickly. The creature was focused on movement. If they could create a distraction on one side of the ship, some of the crew might be able to escape on the other side. The water temperature was below freezing, hovering around -2 degrees Celsius. A human being could survive in those waters for perhaps 15 minutes before hypothermia shut down their body. The nearest land was 6 kilometers away. It was an impossible distance to swim in normal conditions. In freezing water, with a sea serpent hunting them, it was suicide. But staying on the sinking ship was certain death. At least in the water, they had a chance. Victor made the decision. He divided the crew into 2 groups. 6 men and women would stay on the ship, making as much noise and movement as possible to keep the serpent's attention. The other 6, including Elena and Marcus, would slip into the water on the opposite side and swim for shore. Once they were far enough away, the remaining crew would follow. The plan was desperate. It was foolish. It was the only option they had. Elena led the first group to the starboard side, while Victor's team prepared their distraction. They banged on metal drums, threw equipment overboard, and shouted at the creature. The serpent's head swiveled toward the noise, its golden eyes narrowing with what might have been curiosity or hunger. On the other side of the ship, Elena lowered herself into the freezing water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending ice through her veins. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to climb back onto the ship, to escape this killing cold. Instead, she forced herself to breathe and began swimming toward the distant shore. Marcus followed her, then 2 more crew members. They swam in silence, their strokes careful and measured to avoid creating splashes that might attract the serpent's attention. The water was so cold that their muscles began to cramp within the first minute. Elena could feel her fingers going numb, her legs growing heavy and unresponsive. Behind them, the distraction continued. Victor's team threw flares into the water, creating bursts of light and heat that drew the serpent closer to the port side. The creature seemed confused by the activity, its massive head weaving back and forth as it tried to determine the source of the disturbance. The serpent finally detected the swimmers. Its head snapped around, those golden eyes locking onto the small figures struggling through the dark water. It began to move toward them, its powerful body cutting through the waves with terrifying speed. Victor saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed a fuel canister from the engine room and emptied it across the deck. Then he lit a flare and threw it into the spreading pool of diesel fuel. Flames erupted across the port side of the ship, creating a wall of fire that reflected off the water like a second sun. The serpent stopped. Its ancient eyes focused on the burning ship, drawn by the heat and light. For a precious few seconds, it forgot about the swimmers and turned its attention to this new threat. Elena and her group kept swimming. Their bodies were failing them now, muscles refusing to obey commands, minds growing foggy from the cold. But they pushed forward, driven by something deeper than the desire for survival. They were fighting for each other, for the families waiting at home, for the simple human refusal to surrender to death without a struggle. The shore appeared through the mist, rocky and unwelcoming but solid and real. Elena's feet touched bottom, and she dragged herself onto the frozen beach with the last of her strength. Marcus collapsed beside her, his lips blue and his skin pale as snow. But they were alive. Back on the burning ship, Victor and his remaining crew faced a choice. The fire had spread faster than expected, cutting off their access to the starboard side. The only way off the ship was through the water on the port side, directly toward the serpent. The creature had noticed the swimmers again and was turning back toward the open sea, toward the exhausted men and women lying on the distant shore. Victor made his decision. He could not save himself, but he could save the others. He ran to the bridge and pushed the engines to full power. The damaged iron wake groaned and lurched forward, its burning hull plowing through the waves directly toward the Serpent. The creature turned at the last moment, its golden eyes widening in what might have been surprise. The bow of the ship struck it just below the head. 30,000 tons of steel on fire and human defiance slamming into ancient scales. The impact threw Victor across the bridge, shattering bones and tearing flesh. But he was smiling as darkness took him. The Serpent screamed. It was a sound that seemed to come from the depths of time itself, a cry of pain and rage that echoed across the frozen sea. The creature thrashed wildly, its massive body tangled in the wreckage of the ship. Flame spread across its scales, and for the first time in its endless existence, it knew fear. It dove. The Serpent plunged beneath the waves, dragging what remained of the iron wake down into the cold darkness. The fire was extinguished in an instant, and the sea closed over the spot where the ship had been as if it had never existed. On the shore, Elena watched the water grow still. She counted heads. 6 had made it to land. 6 remained somewhere in that frozen sea. She knew in her heart that Victor and the others were gone, that they had sacrificed themselves so that their crewmates could survive. Help came 2 hours later. A Coast Guard helicopter spotted the survivors huddled together on the rocky beach, their bodies pressed close for warmth, their faces turned toward the sea. They were taken to a hospital where doctors marveled at their survival. The water temperature should have killed them in minutes. Instead, they had swum 6 kilometers through freezing waves while being hunted by a creature that should not exist. The official report listed the cause of the iron wake's loss as extreme weather conditions. No one mentioned the Serpent. No one talked about Victor's final charge or the creature's scream as fire spread across its scales. But the survivors knew the truth. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew cold from the north, they would gather together and raise a glass to the captain who had driven his burning ship into the jaws of a monster so that his crew might live. The sea kept its secrets, but the men and women who survived that day carried something with them for the rest of their lives. They had faced the impossible and refused to surrender. They had looked into the ancient eyes of a predator older than human civilization and told it no. They were fishermen, ordinary people, who worked hard jobs for modest wages. But on that day, in those freezing waters, they proved that ordinary humans were capable of extraordinary courage. The Serpent was never seen again. Some said Victor had killed it. Others believed it had simply returned to whatever dark corner of the ocean it called home. But the survivors knew the truth. They had wounded it. They had taught it that human beings were not easy prey, that even the smallest and weakest of them would fight with everything they had. And perhaps, somewhere in the depths, the creature remembered that lesson. Perhaps it told others of its kind to stay away from the boats that sailed the northern waters. Perhaps it had learned to fear the strange, stubborn, impossibly brave creatures that called themselves humans. Elena returned to the sea 6 months later. She captained her own vessel now, a newer ship that she had named Victor's Light. She sailed the same waters where her friends had died, pulling fish from the depths and watching the horizon for signs of danger. She was not afraid. She had survived the worst the ocean could throw at her, and she had come out stronger. The crew of the Iron Wake had proven something important that day. They had shown that humanity's greatest strength was not technology or weapons or numbers. It was the simple refusal to give up, the deep and unshakable belief that survival was possible even when every fact said otherwise. It was the willingness to sacrifice everything for others, to face certain death with courage and defiance. The Serpent had been strong, but the humans had been stronger, and that made all the difference.